Hi folks, and welcome to the second of a two-part series of online video lessons that's intended to provide you some basic principles in the study of argument and argumentation. In the first video of this two-part series, we talked a bit about how to define what an argument is and what the fundamental components of an argument are and how they function together. And one of the things that we mentioned in that video was the importance of context. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the notion of argument contexts, particularly two similar but distinct ideas to understand how argument can be understood in terms of context. And those are the concepts of argument fields and argument spheres. So let's get started. Now, as we talked about last time, argument is defined by Inch and Tudor as a set of statements in which a claim is made, support is offered for it, and there is an attempt to influence someone in a context of disagreement. Our first video talks especially about how arguments function, focusing on the notions of claim, support, and influence. We're going to focus in this video on the idea of the context of disagreement. As you may recall, if you saw the last video, the basic structure of an argument involves a claim being offered, evidence being used to support that claim, and then reasoning being involved to provide the inferential leap between the evidence and the claim. Now, an important part in all of this is played by the role of the context of disagreement. We discussed context as basically that matrix of ideas and beliefs and material conditions and events and situations and environments that all have an impact on the way the claim, the evidence, and the reasoning are constructed and are interpreted, both by arguers and audiences. What's important to note about the context is not just that the argument takes place within the context, but the arguer is going to have to consider, and the audience will interpret, such things as whether or not the evidence being used to support the claim is relevant, reasonable, and sufficient evidence, and or whether or not the reasoning being used to connect the evidence to the claim is relevant, appropriate, sound, and reasonable in order to support the claim. So the role of context is going to be really important. One of those circumstances is what Toulmin refers to as argument fields. You can understand argument fields as sociological contexts for arguments, marked by patterns of communication that participants in argumentative disputes can recognize. The basic idea is that in different fields of human activity, we're going to have different sets of ideas and information, as well as ways in which we communicate about those ideas and information. Certain assumptions about what is true or false, certain assumptions about what is reasonable or unreasonable evidence and reasoning. This sounds a little weird on the abstract, but the idea is actually pretty simple. If you think about certain professional fields, such as medicine, education, law, engineering, biochemistry, religion, and theology, or any subsets of those kinds of areas, and of course a whole lot more. Each of these professions involves specific bodies of information, specific ways of thinking about how you construct reasonable assumptions and arguments to back up certain kinds of claims. After all, we go to different kinds of graduate or professional school programs, for instance, to learn how to become a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or an engineer or a theologian or a priest or a laboratory researcher. We have to go and get these specific undergraduate majors and graduate degrees or professional certificates because these fields require different sorts of ways to argue. And so, take for example the controversy of abortion in the United States. It's a very heated dispute and has been for decades and probably continue to be in the future. Now, one of the ways we can understand why this is such a complicated controversy to resolve is thinking about the ways that different arguments about this controversy stem from different fields of argument. So, for instance, if you consider particular arguments that come from the field of religion, and not just the field of religion more broadly, but particular religious traditions, such as Roman Catholicism or other forms of evangelical Protestant Christianity, there are specific assumptions being made about the notion of life beginning at conception. However, there are many, for instance, in the field of medical science, that argue that it's really not reasonable to consider the life of a human being as beginning at conception, because at that moment it's not distinguishable as a human being that is capable of life. Many of these medical experts are going to argue that life as a human being really doesn't begin in a meaningful sense until the fetus has developed up to such a state that they can successfully live outside of the mother's womb. Now, if you were to ask biochemists or other forms of scientific researchers on when does life begin at conception, or does life begin at viability? And depending on the specific scientific discipline, you may get different sorts of arguments. Some might argue, well, yes, life does begin at conception. There is living cells, for instance, but there is no mind. And arguably, if there is no mind and there are no organs, it's not really a living person, but it is a living set of cellular material. You may ask others, and they may take a different sort of stance, depending on the perspective that they're taking from their various fields. Now, what makes this complicated is you've got folks arguing on whether or not the termination of a fetus is legitimate or not from a moral, an ethical, and a social perspective. And so you've got folks in the argument field of law trying to sort this stuff out and trying to balance different ways in which medical science might be telling us, well, is it a human being or is it not a human being? The commitment of those from a religious or moral standpoint, or even some that are taking it from a scientific standpoint, that you do have a life that starts immediately. And then, of course, there are a whole other set of assumptions that the law needs to take into account that intersect with this question. For instance, none of these particular points of view regarding whether or not life begins at conception has anything to do with the rights of individual autonomy and to do with one's body, what one will, that come from other sorts of argument fields. So as you can see, whether or not an argument is going to be deemed reasonable from a logical perspective or persuasive from a rhetorical perspective may depend in large part on what field of argument provides the assumptions about evidence and reasoning. Okay, so that's argument fields. Let's consider the other idea, argument spheres. Argument spheres can be understood, according to Inch and Tudor, as social constructs that guide how arguments are produced and evaluated. Now, at first glance, this definition is going to feel very, very similar to the definition for argument field. That's why we've got to think about these things contextually rather than just memorize the definition. When we're thinking about argument spheres, what we're talking about are broader categories of assumptions about evidence and reasoning and argument: the personal sphere, the technical sphere, and the public sphere. Each of these broader areas of human activity involves different kinds of assumptions and actions regarding argument and reasoning and persuasion. We can understand the personal sphere in terms of where arguments are made and evaluated by people who are engaged in a personal relationship. So when you think about family members, friends and acquaintances, romantic partners, in these kinds of relationships, we have to resolve conflict through the use of argument all the time. And so the kinds of arguments that take place between folks in these kinds of relationships can be understood as arguments in the personal sphere. So for instance, if you consider a married couple trying to figure out how to maintain the household budget and to pay all the various bills for the family, you can think about arguments being made in terms of the personal sphere. Within a family, they're going to have certain kinds of assumptions they make about what are the important priorities for their family, what kinds of things do they need to put first. Now, these kinds of assumptions about what to do and how to do it when it comes to home and family finance is going to vary from family to family, and it's going to vary from relationship to relationship. And so, what's going to be a reasonable argument within one family may not be seen as a reasonable argument if you try to pass it to another family, because the relationship is going to really provide the context of disagreement for those kinds of arguments. So that's argument in the personal sphere. When we're talking about argument in the technical sphere, we're talking about the fact that arguments are made among people who are experts in their respective fields. So if we're talking about arguments that happen between researchers, arguments that happen within particular profession groups, arguments that take place regarding specific technical or specialized activities. So, for instance, if you think about an academic or a professional conference where you've got a panel of presenters, these are folks that are all experts. They have experience and or extended education in their fields, and so they develop specific norms and patterns, and they're discussed from the standpoint of that particular area of activity. So you can think about arguments in the technical sphere in terms of the idea of argument fields that we just talked about a few minutes ago. If the argument is taking place within a specific area of specialized human activity within a particular argument field, we can think about these as arguments in the technical sphere. Finally, we've got arguments in the public sphere. According to Inch and Tudor, in the public sphere, arguments are made to general audiences that are evaluated using standards created by the general audiences. These are the kinds of arguments that you might be most familiar with from the media regarding politics and public policy, commercial communication, the communication of sales and related sorts of things, and communication out there in the world regarding social and cultural values, the kinds of discussions we have in the community about what we want from our politics, what we want in our society. So, if you think about a social movement like Black Lives Matter, for instance, this discourse regarding civil rights for people of color, specifically African Americans, the important controversy regarding police brutality or other forms of systematic racism that is resulting in violence against the black community. The activities of the social movement and the arguments that are being made are intended for a general public because the impacts of the problem hit the general public, especially people of color, but arguably our entire society is impacted negatively by problems of violent racism. So I think this illustrates pretty well the idea of argument in the public sphere. When we're talking in public, in the broader social or community context about issues that affect everybody. And so the norms for what constitutes evidence and reasoning and argument and these kinds of issues are things that collectively we as a society, we in our communities put together. So let's illustrate this idea by thinking about a specific public controversy, global warming and climate change. Whenever winter happens, for instance, and especially in the winter of 2014-15, this was a specific concept that came up in the media a lot. Some observation about the seemingly tenuous relationship between claims in the scientific community that the Earth is warming and some pretty significant winter storms and huge snowfall rates in specific regions, particularly in the Midwestern and Eastern United States, as illustrated in this editorial cartoon. Tell me again why global warming is bad? There was some confusion perpetuated by some media sources. So you can see how this confusion might take place when you think about some of the ways in which there might be conflict between arguments coming from different spheres. So, for instance, within the public sphere, people reason and argue primarily based on common sense reasoning based on shared experience. What would reasonable people assume to be true in a specific situation? And this is what's going to drive what makes good argument and evidence. And so, for instance, not everybody in the public, lots of people in the public did not take this view, but there were a good chunk of people, particularly on some news networks, that would make the observation, well, the Earth can't be getting warmer. We're having huge snowstorms. We've got massively low wind chill factors. This doesn't make sense. If the Earth was getting warmer, shouldn't things be warmer? They were talking about melting polar ice caps and all this stuff. Now, if you just look at it in those terms, terms, maybe that idea might give you some pause. However, there are arguments coming out of the technical sphere. Consider scientific reasoning based on the argument field of meteorology. You've got lots of, in fact, the overwhelming over 95% of world scientists take the view that yes, the Earth is warming, climate change is real, and arguments were being offered in response to the one you just heard, something like this: global warming, climate changes cause shifts in meteorological patterns that result in extreme weather events. So just because you've got big snowstorms and really low temperatures coming out of those extreme winter storms, that doesn't mean that the Earth isn't warming. So the difficulty sometimes is that people who are operating solely in their particular section of the public sphere, the people that they talk to and listen to most frequently, might have difficulty coming to grips with arguments that are coming from the technical sphere. And similarly, folks that are arguing from the technical sphere, scientists and researchers and academics, sometimes don't make and offer their arguments in ways that the general public is really able to comprehend. So what seems to be necessary under these circumstances is ideally if the public sphere and the technical sphere are able to intersect in such a way that folks that are coming from a specific scientific or technical or academic area of expertise are able to translate their arguments into ways that the general public, the average reasonable person, can understand. And similarly, if those in the general public learn enough about how to understand scientific discourse in the popular media so that they can separate between what is a good scientific argument and what is a junky scientific argument, then we can perhaps come to some kind of resolution regarding these seemingly contrary arguments. So ultimately, when you're thinking about these issues and studying them, remember why context is important to argument, with the especially important notion that when human beings argue, they don't argue in a vacuum, that the way that arguments are constructed and presented and evaluated depends on the context within which they reside. And some important ways you can think about that context involves the concept of argument fields, those specific areas of human activity that involve specialized knowledge and experience, as well as argument spheres, those broader areas of human activity, the public sphere, the personal sphere, and the technical sphere, that involve broader assumptions about what we argue about and how we argue. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.